I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
It was one of those mornings when Oxford wore its melancholy without apology, the stone walls absorbing the drizzle as though they had always expected to be dressed in grey. I had wandered into the quad without any real purpose, save perhaps the desire to avoid the rooms that pressed too heavily with silence. The paving stones were slick with damp, and the leaves of Michaelmas had arranged themselves into neat conspiracies along the walls, as if they too had gathered to whisper. There are quads in Oxford that invite gaiety, where undergraduates spill wine and laughter into the air, but this one seemed to cultivate silence. Its benches had long forgotten the warmth of students who had lingered through afternoons of Latin conjugations or the fluttering intoxication of first romances. The air smelled faintly of rain and burnt toast drifting from kitchens I could not see. I sat down on one of the benches, brushing aside a wet sycamore leaf that had chosen the spot as its grave. My mind had been circling darker matters, though none I was ready to name. Perhaps it was the particular silence of the place that reminded me of how time corrodes names, how memories of faces slip between our fingers as easily as rainwater down glass. I thought of those who had pressed their pens too hard into exercise books, their love confessions scratched onto oak desks, their triumphs consigned to yellowing examination scripts stacked and forgotten in some archivist's drawer. We imagine permanence in youth, but the city is a mausoleum of impermanence. The porter found me there, though he did not come with purpose. He walked the perimeter of the quad in a fashion that was less about duty and more about the maintenance of habit. I heard his cough before I noticed him. He remarked, in that off-hand manner common to men who spend their lives beside old things, that the refurbishment of the dining hall had produced one curiosity. A name, he said, had been scratched into the underside of one of the long oak tables. He did not look at me as he said it, and perhaps that is why I asked him to repeat it. He shrugged, adjusting his cap against the drizzle, and explained that carpenters had shifted the table to repair a warped leg. In so doing, they found the name, carved deeply, but not where any idle undergraduate might have wanted it seen. I asked what name. He frowned as though retrieving it from the fog of memory was an effort not entirely worth the price. Winslow, he said. Arthur Winslow. It was nothing, he added. Students carved all sorts in those days. Yet the cadence of his dismissal did not persuade me. I felt an odd tightening in the chest, the sort that occurs when a word on a crossword begins to insist on its presence, though one has not yet written it down. Winslow. The name once spoken seemed to linger longer than was reasonable in the damp air of the quad. I asked him when the carving might have been made. He did not know. The table was older than either of us, and the name might have been there for decades unseen. It was the sort of relic that amused masons but rarely interested anyone beyond them. He gave me a courteous nod and went on his circuit, vanishing beneath an archway where the drizzle deepened into rain. Alone again, I let the sound of his words replay in my mind. Winslow. The oak, the underside of a table, the secrecy of that gesture. I had no clear reason to be intrigued, and yet I was. A name carved where no eye should readily fall. A furtive act, one might say, unless the hand that carved it had known its end was imminent. It is curious how an apparently trifling observation will fix itself more firmly than matters of supposed gravity. I could not let it go. The quad blurred in my sight, its walls softening into the grey of memory, and I thought then of all the names written in margins, in hymnals, in anonymous letters sent and never claimed. Names are scratched into wood, into stone, even into one another's hearts, yet they fade. Unless, of course, something prevents their fading. That morning, with drizzle painting the edges of my coat, I felt the first tug of a thread I could not yet see, and if I had known then where it would lead, I might still have followed, though not without the same dull ache of anticipation that always accompanied such beginnings. Winslow, a name I would hear again. Lewis brought the file to me as though it were no more significant than a weather report. He had that way of sliding documents across a table, unadorned with commentary, as if expecting me to provide the color, the texture, the resonance. It was mid-afternoon, and the drizzle had thickened into rain, blotting the quad into a pool of greys. My glass of whiskey remained untouched at my elbow, a small amber consolation I had not yet permitted myself. Arthur Winslow. The name repeated itself in neat type on the thin pages Lewis had handed me. I traced it with a fingertip as though contact might conjure more than ink. The records were blunt. Undergraduate, classics, matriculated in 1940, disappeared in 1943. The conclusion was noted with bureaucratic certainty. Voluntary absence. The phrase suggested a young man walking away from his college rooms as lightly as one abandons a lecture on Cicero. Lewis mentioned that the matter had been closed within a fortnight. A missing student was not entirely unusual during those years, not when the world itself was unraveling. The war absorbed absences. Men left for service or slipped into the shadows without explanation, and Oxford itself became a half-haunted city of arrivals and departures. Yet the file hinted at unease. A fellow had noted that Winslow left his books stacked neatly on his desk, his watch and fountain pen still lying beside them. These were not the gestures of a man intending never to return. I asked Lewis where he had been last seen. He leafed back through the file and answered that Winslow had attended a formal dinner the evening he vanished. The very hall where the scratched name had been found, Lewis added, as though this detail carried little weight. To me it carried too much. The idea of a man departing from such a scene, the oak tables, the glint of silver, the Latin grace still echoing in stone, only to dissolve into absence, struck me with an unease I could not name. Lewis, with his practical calm, suggested Winslow had perhaps tired of the academic life or had been called into service. He reminded me that the 1940s were full of such abrupt departures. Yet the word scratched haunted me. There is nothing voluntary about carving one's name into oak with deliberate force. It spoke of urgency, of leaving a mark where words could not be spoken. The file contained a single blurred photograph. A group of students outside the college gate, their smiles too broad, their postures too stiff. Winslow stood at the edge, tall, unsmiling, his eyes directed not at the camera but toward some private horizon. I stared at that face longer than I should have, the way one stares at a half-remembered dream. Lewis asked if I believed the carving mattered. I told him I did not know, though of course I did. A man does not inscribe his name beneath a table leg without reason. He does not vanish from a formal dinner without leaving some whisper of himself behind. And the city, with its long appetite for secrets, rarely forgets altogether. I closed the file and poured the whiskey. The rain outside had grown insistent, tapping the glass like a reminder. 40 years ago, Arthur Winslow had walked out of that hole and into disappearance. The case had been folded neatly away, filed among other absences. Yet the table had remembered him, and now so would I. In Oxford, silence is never empty. It is only another form of record. The dining hall always struck me as a kind of theatre, where the rituals of formality disguised the ordinariness of hunger. On that morning, it was empty save for the muffled echo of our steps, and I could not help but imagine the countless dinners performed here, the clatter of cutlery, the sigh of Latin graces, the rustle of gowns shifting against benches. The air smelled faintly of polish and damp wood, as though the walls themselves had soaked up decades of ceremony. Lewis and I approached the oak table at the far end, the one that carpenters had shifted and found unwilling to forget. The surface was long and burnished, scarred by time but still carrying its gravity. We crouched together, awkward in our positions, peering beneath like schoolboys hiding from a master. There it was. Winslow. The name was shallow in its depth, yet unmistakably deliberate, the lines cut hastily as though time had been an adversary. It was not artful. It was a man's assertion against erasure. Lewis observed that any undergraduate might have done it, that carving one's name into furniture was hardly a confession. But the location troubled me. To scratch beneath a table leg, hidden from view unless the oak were dismantled, was no idle act of vanity. It was the gesture of someone who needed secrecy, or who expected his message to be found only when the right eyes came searching. I ran my fingers across the grooves, feeling their resistance, and imagined the hand that pressed the blade against the wood. I asked myself whether he was laughing as he did so, or dying. A fellow had agreed to meet us there. Dr. Mallory, his gown hanging loosely from his stooped shoulders. He looked at the table with the distracted gaze of a man recalling his own past as much as Winslow's. I asked him what he remembered. He hesitated, the sort of pause that reveals more than the words that follow. There had been whispers, he said, something about Winslow and a tutor's wife. No one could be certain, of course. Gossip in those days travelled faster than truth, and Oxford had an appetite for scandal that exceeded its appetite for scholarship. Lewis pressed him, but Mallory offered little more. Winslow had been brilliant, yes, but restless. Too clever by half, some had said. He lingered at the edge of things, never quite belonging, yet never content to remain unnoticed. And then Mallory said something almost idly, that Winslow had once written an essay on Tennyson, where he had misquoted a line from In Memoriam. So, the error had been peculiar, for Winslow knew his poetry as well as any man in the college. I asked what the misquotation had been. Mallory frowned, straining his memory, and recalled that Winslow had written, "The silence that is in the starless sky, the sleep that is among the lonely hills." The true line, of course, speaks of solemnity, not loneliness. A small change, a single word, yet I found myself dwelling on it as though it mattered. To alter Tennyson was to betray something of one's own mind, perhaps even one's own confession. Lewis looked at me with that expression he reserved for moments when he suspected I was indulging myself in irrelevancies. Perhaps I was. Yet irrelevance is often the first disguise of significance. A name scratched into oak, a line of poetry altered by choice or accident, a whisper of a woman who should not have been noticed. I felt these fragments settling together like stones in a wall, though the shape of the structure was not yet clear. Mallory excused himself, leaving us alone in the echoing hall. Lewis remarked that the carving might be no more than a boy's mischief, that the gossip of an affair was an old man's indulgence in memory. I did not argue. I only stood there, letting my gaze drift across the high windows where the rain patterned the glass. It seemed to me then that Oxford's truth was never shouted. It was carved beneath tables, misquoted in essays, left lingering in the sigh of a fellow reluctant to recall. Winslow had vanished, yes, but he had left his name, and perhaps more, hidden where the careless would not look. I traced the groove once more and thought of the word loneliness. It clung to me longer than it should have, like the aftertaste of an unfinished glass of wine. The faces of the past rarely present themselves without distortion. Time clouds them, and self-preservation does the rest. As I began to collect the fragments of Arthur Winslow, what emerged was not a portrait, but a series of overlapping masks, each worn by those who had known him and wished to be seen as knowing little. Dr. Mallory was the first. He sat opposite me in his rooms, the fire struggling against the damp air, his gown thrown across the arm of a chair like a discarded skin. He spoke with the ease of a man who had rehearsed his memories long enough to polish them. Winslow, he said, had been brilliant but reckless, too eager to shine, too willing to gamble with reputation. Mallory shook his head at the recollection, the gesture tinged with something between admiration and relief. Recklessness was a useful label. It excused both affection and detachment. I noticed, however, that his hands fidgeted with a pipe that had long gone cold, as though the matter still unsettled him in ways he would not confess. Professor Harding, by contrast, preferred the vocabulary of suspicion. We met in the library where he kept his domain, among the scent of vellum and dust. Harding recalled Winslow as secretive, a man obsessed with riddles and codes, more interested in hiding truths than discovering them. He spoke of puzzles Winslow left in common room conversations, of cryptic references in essays that seemed designed more to tease than to illuminate. Harding's lips thinned as he spoke, as though he had been the butt of those intellectual games and had never quite forgiven them. To Harding, Winslow was not reckless, but calculating, a mind turned inward upon itself like a labyrinth. And then there was Mrs. Ellison. Age had given her a quiet dignity, the widow of a tutor whose name still lingered in college minutes. She agreed to see me in her drawing room, where the curtains were drawn against the persistent rain and the air smelled faintly of lavender. She remembered Winslow's intense glances, the kind that made one feel both seen and unsettled. But impropriety? No, she said. There had been none. Her voice carried the firmness of denial, but also the softness of memory, as though she could not quite erase the heat of being looked at so directly by youth. She offered tea, her hands steady, her eyes fixed just beyond me, as if reading from a script written long ago. Each account contradicted the others, and yet confirmed something essential. Mallory's reckless prodigy, Harding's cryptic loner, Mrs. Ellison's unsettling admirer. None of these portraits could be reconciled, and yet none felt wholly false. Memory is rarely accurate. It is curated, trimmed of discomfort, adorned with just enough detail to appear sincere. What struck me most was not what they said of Winslow, but what their recollections revealed of themselves. Mallory sought to preserve the etched reputation of the college, Harding his own intellectual dignity, Mrs. Ellison the sanctity of a marriage long buried. Their testimonies were less about Winslow than about their own survival. Lewis listened beside me during these conversations, his silence marked by the occasional tightening of the jaw. Later, when we walked back across the quad, he muttered that everyone seemed more interested in protecting themselves than in telling the truth. I agreed, though I did not tell him that this was precisely what fascinated me. In every evasion there is a shape, and in every denial a whisper. The shadows of these suspects lengthened in my mind. Winslow was not a man, but a prism, each observer bending him to their own light. Somewhere within those distortions lay the reason a young man had carved his name into oak before vanishing into history. And it seemed to me that Oxford, with its libraries, its fires, its lavender-scented rooms, was determined to keep that reason cloaked in the half-light of memory. The Bodleian always carried for me a silence that was never still. Beneath the vast dome and along the narrow corridors, the air seemed to breathe with the weight of centuries, as though each manuscript exhaled its secrets into the hush. I had spent half a lifetime in libraries, and yet that day I felt an unease, the kind one feels when a hand has left something behind deliberately, knowing another would one day stumble upon it. I had gone in search of Winslow, not in the archives that bore his name, but in the marginal places where young men often leave themselves. His essays had told me little, save that he liked to alter a line when it suited him, and his photograph had only confirmed his absence. So I turned to the books he might have touched. Latin verse, of which he was said to have been enamored, though in ways more playful than reverent. The volume was Horace, its spine loosened, its pages smelling faintly of mildew and dust. It yielded itself reluctantly, as if tired of hands that came only to plunder. Somewhere near the center, a slip of paper fell into my lap, yellowed and fragile. Not a student's note, nor a librarian's tag, but a letter, folded twice, the ink browned with age, the script hurried and cramped. Lewis, who had been prowling the shelves with less patience, looked over my shoulder as I smoothed the paper. The words were jagged, as though written with a hand not entirely steady. There was no signature, no address, only a brief message. All debts must be settled. The phrase appeared twice, once at the beginning and again at the end. the repetition deliberate, almost ritualistic. Lewis muttered that it sounded like blackmail. Perhaps. The letter was accusatory in tone, but also anxious, as though the writer sought to bind not only the recipient, but himself to some unavoidable reckoning. I read it again, tracing the strokes of the pen. The debts of which it spoke, were they financial or moral? And was Winslow the one demanding payment or the one being pursued? We carried the letter to a reading desk where the afternoon light, filtered through tall stained glass, lay across the oak like pale water. I imagined Winslow seated there once, his face illuminated in the same diffused glow, folding this letter and hiding it where only he, or someone who followed him, would ever know to look. Why hide such a thing unless discovery was part of the plan? Lewis, ever practical, declared that it confirmed the stories of gambling debts whispered by Mallory and the others. But I wasn't persuaded. The phrasing was too insistent, too theatrical, as though designed to be read by more than its intended recipient. A clever man might plant such a note to misdirect suspicion. A desperate man might copy the words given to him in fear rather than menace. The letter gnawed at me because it was incomplete. No names, no dates, only that phrase circling upon itself like a snake. All debts must be settled. It had the ring of finality, yes, but also of confession. What if Winslow had been repeating the words of another, preserving them as evidence? What if the blackmailer had not been Winslow at all, but someone within these very walls, cloaked by authority and silence? Lewis asked me what I made of it, and I told him I did not know. It was a half-truth. What I knew was that Oxford's history was crowded with such phrases, the language of men who preferred implication to clarity. But the more I looked at the crooked handwriting, the more I felt the echo of a voice not powerful, but frightened. We replaced the book carefully, though I slipped the letter into the file. The library resumed its breathing, indifferent to our intrusion. Students bent over their desks, the sound of pages turning soft as rainfall. Outside, the rain itself had begun again, steady, insistent, tapping against the glass like a metronome reminding me of time wasted. I walked out into the evening with the words pulsing still in my head. All debts must be settled. A threat, yes, but also a prophecy. And I wondered, not for the first time, whether it was Winslow who had written them, or Winslow who had read them with dread. Lewis returned from London with that look of cautious triumph that policemen wear when they believe they have unearthed a fact that will anchor the whole business. He laid his findings before me in the modest hotel room we were using as a base, the curtains half drawn against the drizzle that seemed unwilling to lift. The report concerned a bookmaker, well known in certain circles, who had apparently kept accounts with more than one undergraduate in Oxford during the war years. Among the names scribbled into those yellowing ledgers, Arthur Winslow's had appeared. Lewis explained with patient detail how the debts mounted, how the sums suggested recklessness, perhaps desperation. The case, to him, began to take on a simpler outline. Winslow, a bright but careless student, fell into gambling, pressed too hard, incurred debts he could not pay, and fled before the reckoning. The letter we had found in the Bodleian seemed to lend itself neatly to this theory. All debts must be settled. The phrase fit like a missing piece of a puzzle. I listened, but irritation gnawed at me. It was too neat, too obliging. Life rarely offers puzzles whose solutions click into place with such obedient symmetry. I told Lewis that bookmakers' ledgers were a convenient chorus in almost any undergraduate tragedy, and that to rest a disappearance upon so familiar a prop was to accept the first answer when the last one might prove more significant. He frowned, as he often did when my refusals seemed arbitrary. But I could not let go of the image of the table. That oak slab in the dining hall had fastened itself upon my mind, like a recurring motif in a symphony. Why scratch his name there, beneath the leg, hidden from view, only to be discovered when time itself shifted the furniture? If Winslow had meant his name to be seen, there were countless more immediate places to carve it. But he had chosen concealment. Concealment not from his contemporaries, but from the present, from us. I explained this to Lewis, though my words sounded less persuasive aloud than they had in thought. Still, I insisted the carving was not vanity. It was testament, left in haste, perhaps under duress. The debts in London might have existed, yes, but to tether the whole mystery to them seemed cowardly. Too many young men had debts, yet only one had vanished and left his name cut into oak. Lewis muttered that I was chasing shadows. Perhaps I was. Yet the shadows felt more substantial than the ledger he had brought back. The bookmaker's name was known, his threats routine. There was nothing singular there. What was singular was Winslow, crouched beneath the table one evening, steel in hand, marking the wood with letters that had outlived him. That evening, I sat alone in the hall once more. The long tables stretched before me, polished, solemn, bearing their invisible histories. I imagined Winslow at dinner, the laughter of fellows around him, the candlelight glancing off silver. And then, afterwards, remaining behind, stooping low, scratching into the underside of the oak while footsteps receded and the night pressed close. Did he believe someone would one day turn the table and find him there? Or was it nothing more than the last gesture of a man who knew he would not see another dawn? The debts in London might have been real, but they rang hollow against the echo of that single act. I dismissed the bookmaker with a flick of irritation, as one dismisses a crossword clue that fits but ruins the symmetry of the grid. Winslow's secret was not measured in shillings owed or wagers lost. It was measured in scratches of a name, hidden for decades, waiting for someone stubborn enough to notice. It was Lewis who brought me the photograph, though he admitted he had not studied it closely. Donation from an alumnus had arrived at the college. Boxes of papers, playbills, fading cartes de visite, curiosities from a life once lived in gowns and candlelight. Among them, a group photograph had been discovered, the sort students posed for in the days before the war, rows of faces caught in the stiff choreography of formality, each smile rehearsed, each gaze directed dutifully at the camera. I studied it at my desk beneath the half-hearted glow of a lamp. The men, most of them, stood shoulder to shoulder with that peculiar mixture of bravado and shyness that youth cultivates. Yet one figure disrupted the symmetry. Arthur Winslow stood a pace apart, not quite detached, but never entirely belonging. He was tall, solemn, his dark eyes refusing the lens. They were fixed instead toward the margin of the photograph, where a woman had been allowed into the frame. The woman was younger then, though the features were unmistakable. Mrs. Ellison, in her 20s, her face turned slightly, as if uncertain whether she was permitted her place. There was an elegance in the tilt of her head, the quiet self-possession of someone who knew she was being observed. Winslow's gaze caught her in a way that unsettled me, a gaze not of impropriety, perhaps, but of intensity. To see her through his eyes, even at such a remove of years, was to feel the stillness between them. Yet what drew me more was not Winslow's stare, but a detail so faint I might have missed it had I not lingered, as I always did, longer than necessary. Near Mrs. Ellison's hand, on the bench where she sat, the blurred outline of another hand appeared. A man's hand, resting just close enough to suggest possession, its edges indistinct but undeniable. The rest of the figure was obscured, lost in the crowd, but the implication was clear. She was not alone in that corner of the photograph. I felt the prickle of recognition then, not of faces, but of arrangements. It was never Winslow and the woman, not as the whispers claimed. It was Winslow and the husband. Dr. Ellison, tutor, fellow, guardian of his college's respectability. The triangle lay not between desire and virtue, but between knowledge and power. Winslow's gaze may have lingered on the woman, but it was her husband whose shadow lay across the photograph, whose hand intruded silently into the frame. Lewis leaned over my shoulder, squinting at the smudged corner. He muttered that it might be nothing more than a trick of the light, the blurring of an old camera. But I knew better. Oxford photographs are never innocent. They capture not merely what was seen, but what was intended to be unseen. I had spent years looking into such frames, and I trusted the impulse that told me this was deliberate, whether by chance or fate. The photograph remained with me all evening. I poured whiskey and let the rain mark time against the window. Winslow's face haunted the lamplight. Serious, unsmiling, his body angled ever so slightly away from the others. A man who already knew he was not destined to remain among them, and Mrs. Ellison, whose presence had been permitted but framed, and beside her the faint hand of authority. What passed between those three lives I could not yet name, but the photograph offered a geometry of tension, a quiet declaration that the scandal had never been about illicit glances in drawing rooms. It was about discovery. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine Winslow at that moment, the shutter clicking, the air filled with the nervous laughter of students. Did he know even then that he was staring at something forbidden, not because of desire, but because of knowledge? Did Dr. Ellison sense it, the threat of being seen? And was Mrs. Ellison's stillness the stillness of complicity or of fear? When I returned the photograph to its envelope, the rain had stopped, though the air smelled of stone and damp wood. I felt as though Winslow had left me another clue. Not in oak this time, but in silver nitrate. A young man's gaze, a woman's silence, a shadow of a hand. All debts must be settled, the letter had said. Perhaps this was the first debt, the one Winslow could not help but notice, and for which he had paid far too dearly. Lewis brought it in with the care of a man carrying something fragile. Though the object was nothing more than a small leather-bound diary, its spine cracked, its cover dulled to a weary brown. The archivist had unearthed it from a collection of papers belonging to Dr. Ellison, tutor, fellow, husband, widower. Its pages smelled faintly of dust and ink, the scent of a life once lived in ink strokes and abbreviations. We sat together in the dim light of my rooms, the rain muffling itself against the window panes. Lewis read aloud while I poured wine. The entries were sparse, a man's clipped notations of lectures given, dinners attended, supervisions endured. But every so often, a name emerged. Winslow. Once in March, again in April. Routine remarks, no more than a tutor's obligation to record his duties, and then, between April and May, an absence. A page torn clean, the edges jagged where the paper had been removed. Lewis looked at me and asked if it mattered. Of course it mattered. Diaries rarely lose their pages by accident. What was once written there had unsettled Ellison enough to excise it, leaving behind the ghost of what had been. I felt the silence of that missing page more keenly than all the words that remained. I drank too quickly and let the wine blur the edges of the room. Ellison had always been regarded as a man of respectability, of learning, of loyalty to his college. Yet the absence spoke more loudly than the presence. A tutor with nothing to conceal would not have torn a page from his own record. I imagined him at his desk late at night, candle guttering low, staring at the damning words before pulling them free. A man does not erase without remembering what he erases. Lewis frowned, unconvinced, muttering that it might have been trivial. An argument, a personal matter, perhaps something unrelated to Winslow altogether. I did not answer. The wine was warm in my throat, and I let my mind drift to the photograph, to the shadow of a hand near Mrs. Ellison, to Winslow's unyielding stare. All fragments, all disconnected, yet each hinting at a pattern too deliberate to ignore. On the table beside me lay that day's crossword, half finished, the ink smudged where my hand had pressed too firmly. My eyes fell upon a clue I had circled earlier but left unsolved. To erase, one must first inscribe. 6 letters. I had dismissed it before, finding no entry that fit. But now the words seemed to coil into meaning. To erase, one must first inscribe. Ellison had inscribed, then erased. Winslow had carved, then vanished. Both acts spoke of presence, followed by absence, the two inseparable. The phrase unsettled me. It suggested that nothing is ever wholly removed, that every erasure is itself a kind of testimony. The torn page, the scratched name, the misquoted Tennyson, all inscriptions of men who wished to conceal and yet could not help but reveal. I felt the room tilt with that thought, the wine pressing too heavily on my chest, and wondered whether Winslow had understood this better than any of us. Lewis closed the diary gently and said it was late. I let him take it, though my eyes lingered on the raw edge where the page had been torn. Absence is not silence. It speaks, if one knows how to listen. And that night, as I poured another glass I did not need, I could almost hear Winslow's name etched again beneath the oak, whispering against the quiet of the room, reminding me that what is erased never truly vanishes. The senior common room smelt of sherry and coal dust, the sort of atmosphere that encourages agreement rather than dissent. I had gathered the fellows there not to please them, but to test a theory, and as I laid it before them, I could sense their relief, swelling like a tide. Arthur Winslow, I suggested, had discovered something unbecoming of Dr. Ellison. Perhaps debts, perhaps indiscretions, it hardly mattered which. He had attempted to blackmail his tutor, but had been caught out, confronted, and forced to flee. It explained the letter hidden in Horace, the phrase that echoed like a verdict. All debts must be settled. It accounted, too, for the whispers of scandal that had clung for decades, the vague rumors of impropriety. Winslow was reckless, Ellison proud, the clash inevitable. Dr. Mallory gave a satisfied cough into his hand. Harding looked grim but appeased, as though I had delivered an acceptable epitaph on the matter. Even Mrs. Ellison, present with the dignity of age, inclined her head as though the explanation had lifted some faint burden. Relief is always louder than truth. They wanted an ending that did not unpick their lives. I had given them one. Yet I felt none of their ease. The words left my mouth without conviction, as if I was speaking a line rehearsed for a play I had not chosen to join. Lewis, beside me, seemed half convinced, but his eyes searched mine with that patience he reserved for moments when he suspected I was unconvinced myself. He was right. Later, in the quiet of my own rooms, I returned to Ellison's diary. The torn page still troubled me, the absence shouting across the silence of the remaining leaves. I read the entries again, tracing the cramped Latin notations that had marked his days. Then I saw it. A line from Horace, written idly in the margin. Nunc bibendum est. I froze. The phrase on its own was not wrong. But it was not the way Horace wrote it. The true line, nunc est bibendum, had always been fixed in my mind, hammered there by years of schoolmasters and examinations. Any classicist would know the rhythm, the inevitability of it. Ellison, least of all, would not invert it. He had been precise to the point of pedantry, a man who corrected undergraduates with more zeal than compassion. For him to misquote Horace was unthinkable. I poured whiskey and stared at the page, the words shifting slightly in the lamplight. If Ellison had not written it, who had? And if he had, why had he written it incorrectly? Was it haste, drunkenness, or something else entirely, a hand pretending to be his, a record not of memory, but of invention? The fellows had taken my theory as balm. They believed Winslow had been the aggressor, the blackmailer, and Ellison the wronged man. It allowed them to preserve the dignity of the college, to let the silence of the missing page remain unbroken. But the misquoted Horace gnawed at me. It suggested tampering, a forgery perhaps, or a slip by someone unaccustomed to true scholarship. Lewis had once teased me about my fondness for crosswords, for how a single misplaced letter could ruin an entire grid. Yet it was always the misplaced letter that mattered most. To erase, one must first inscribe. The crossword clue from the other evening returned to me now, with a kind of dreadful clarity. Ellison, or someone using his diary, had inscribed, but the act of concealment had left behind a flaw. The misquote was not a triviality. It was a fingerprint. I leaned back in my chair, the room thick with the fumes of drink and unease. My theory was false. I knew it, though I had allowed it to be accepted. Winslow had not been the blackmailer. If anything, he was the one who had seen too much, the one who had inscribed his name beneath the oak in the hall because he knew that memory would otherwise be erased. The fellows could rest easy with my explanation. I could not. The diary lay open, the words taunting me with their quiet error. And in that error, I sensed the truth beginning, like a faint sound carried across a quad at dusk, just audible enough to disturb one's peace but never loud enough to grant certainty. The hall was empty when I returned, its silence heavy as though it had swallowed decades whole. The long oak tables stretched before me in mute procession, their surfaces polished, their scars unremarked by the generations that had leaned, drunk, and prayed over them. I walked their length slowly, as though each step must account for all the years in which no one had bothered to ask what the wood had once been forced to witness. I bent again to the underside of the table, to the faint grooves where Winslow's hand had pressed his name. I had stared at it before, puzzled by its secrecy, but now I understood. It was not secrecy at all. It was desperation. He had not carved to be remembered. He had carved because he was dying. The vision came to me with terrible clarity. The dinner, the hum of voices rising toward the rafters, candlelight glinting on silver, the steady ritual of courses served and emptied. Somewhere between the wine and the grace, a poison had found its way into Winslow's veins. He had risen, perhaps stumbled, perhaps concealed his distress beneath the courtesies expected of him. And when the hall had thinned, when others had drifted out into the drizzle of an Oxford night, he had remained. A young man fighting for breath, his chest tightening, his sight dimming, crouching to scratch the only proof of himself into oak. I ran my fingers over the letters, feeling the jagged tremor in each line. The haste of them, the failing strength. It was not vanity, but testament, the last act of a life cut short. A message left not for glory, but for survival, even if survival came only in the form of a name carved into wood. The missing page of Ellison's diary returned to me then with merciless force. The torn edge, the silence between April and May, the absence that spoke louder than any entry. He had written something there, something he could not allow to remain. Perhaps the detail of a dinner, a reference to a student's collapse, words that might have betrayed the truth even when cloaked in Latin brevity. He had torn it out, erased it, believing that the silence would endure. But silence is never perfect. A page removed is still a page remembered, and Winslow's name remained long after Ellison's careful concealment. Together they told the same story, a tutor who poisoned, a student who resisted the obliteration of his existence with one final gesture. Lewis asked me, later that night, how certain I was. I did not answer him. Certainty is a luxury, and I had never much trusted it. But I felt the weight of the truth pressing on me, undeniable as the stone walls of the hall themselves. Ellison had killed him, not in a fit of passion, but with calculation, a crime hidden in plain sight, absorbed into the respectability of a college too relieved to believe otherwise. I poured whiskey, though it did nothing to blunt the ache in my chest. What disturbed me most was not the act itself, but the knowledge that the fellows had been almost eager to accept my earlier false theory. They had wanted Winslow to be reckless, foolish, guilty of his own disappearance. They did not want to admit that one of their own had murdered him at the very table where they still ate. I traced the grooves again in my mind as I closed my eyes that night. Winslow had not inscribed his name to endure. He had inscribed it because he was leaving, unwilling, poisoned, and he knew that otherwise he would vanish without trace. It was both epitaph and accusation, his last strength turned into testimony, and I, all these years later, had been the one stubborn enough to listen to what Oak had kept safe when men preferred silence. It was Mrs. Ellison who received me, though I doubted she truly wished to. Age had lent her a dignity so carefully preserved that one hesitated to disturb it, as though even questions might bruise the delicate surface of her composure. She sat in her drawing-room with curtains drawn tight against the morning, a fire laid but unlit, her hands folded in her lap as if waiting for judgment that had never come. I spoke quietly, for the truth required no raising of voice. The diary page had been torn, the gap was too deliberate. What had been written there had unsettled her husband more than he could allow. She listened without interruption, her eyes fixed on some point just past my shoulder, as though memory itself hovered in the air behind me. At last she sighed, a sound brittle and resigned. "Yes," she said, "the missing page was not lost. It had been burned by her own hand." Her voice was steady, but her fingers tightened against each other, pale and unyielding. She had found it among her husband's papers after his death, a page whose words named what Winslow had known. Not an affair, as rumor insisted. Not a romance between a student and a wife. The scandal had been quieter, colder, but more dangerous. Money. Her husband had been guilty of fraud, she said, shifting funds meant for the college into accounts hidden under other names. Winslow had stumbled upon it, perhaps by chance, perhaps through that love of riddles Harding had described. He had confronted Ellison, not with passion, but with proof. And Ellison, a man who had always prized reputation above life itself, had chosen poison over exposure. I asked her why she had destroyed the page. She did not answer at first, then, in a voice almost too soft to hear, she said she had done it for the college, for the fellows, for all that her husband's disgrace would have shattered. Silence had been the only way to preserve what remained of his name. She had believed, or told herself, that Winslow's disappearance could be explained as voluntary absence. A young man leaving Oxford during the war was hardly remarkable. She had let that myth endure, because the alternative was unthinkable. Lewis shifted uneasily beside me, as though the words themselves carried the weight of indictment, but I could not summon anger. What struck me was the bleak inevitability of it all. A student had died not from romance or recklessness, but because he had seen too clearly. A tutor had killed not for lust or jealousy, but for the preservation of reputation, and a woman had burned a page not out of malice, but out of fear, loyalty, perhaps even love twisted into obligation. The fellows, I realized, had known enough. They might not have read the page, but they had felt its absence, had sensed the gap in Ellison's life, had chosen not to peer into it. It had been easier to repeat the convenient fiction of a student who had abandoned his studies. They had lived with that story so long it had hardened into fact. Oxford, after all, thrives on the endurance of myths. Mrs. Ellison's eyes finally met mine. She asked whether I intended to tell the world. I poured the last of the whiskey I had carried in a small flask, though it was too early in the day. I told her that the world had never been much interested in the truth, only in stories it could live with. Winslow's story had been buried for 40 years. Unearthing it now would not bring him back, nor redeem the college, but it would remind me that silence, however polished, is still complicity. She closed her eyes then, as if relieved that I would not force her further into confession. Yet the words had already condemned her, even if no court would ever call. The crime had been hidden, yes, but only through the complicity of all who had chosen to forget. Winslow's death had not been a mystery unsolved, but a truth deliberately buried. When I left, the drizzle had returned. soft against the stone. I thought of Winslow's name scratched beneath the oak, the last resistance of a young man poisoned for seeing too much. Voluntary absence, that had been the phrase. Absence, yes, but never voluntary. His presence endured, faint but unarousable, like the grooves my fingers could still feel in memory long after leaving the hall. The carpenters returned in the spring, their tools sharp, their faces expressionless. I watched from a corner of the dining hall as they set about their task. The oak tables lifted, sanded, smoothed into a new respectability. The grooves where Winslow had pressed his name, the last proof of his existence, disappeared grain by grain. No ceremony marked the erasure. Only the low rasp of sandpaper, the hiss of wood yielding to silence. By the time they had finished, the table gleamed again, unblemished, indifferent. It is the fate of most names in Oxford, I thought. Scratched once, whispered once, and then polished away by time until the wood remembers nothing but itself. The hall seemed almost grateful for the restoration, as though relieved to no longer bear witness to a death that had lingered like a stain. The fellows could eat in peace once more, their silver polished, their Latin graces intact, with no accusation beneath their hands. I left before the tables were reset, before candles and wine could transform the scene into its nightly theatre. Outside, dusk was collecting in the quad. The rain had ceased for once, leaving the stones slick and shining, as if the college had been newly washed of its sins. A few undergraduates hurried across with gowns flapping, their laughter too young to carry the weight of memory. I let them pass. The quad emptied, and I remained, listening to the stillness settle. The walls loomed with that peculiar authority that Oxford wears in the half-light, when the day has thinned, but the night has not yet taken hold. Somewhere a bell struck, the sound hollow, indifferent to the puzzle it had told over for 40 years. I thought then of Winslow, not the myths or the whispers, but the man. A young scholar seated at dinner, raising a glass, and later, in the grip of poison, crouching beneath a table to carve his name. It seemed to me an act of contradiction. Was it despair, the last effort of a fading hand, to insist that he had lived at all? Or was it defiance, a refusal to be erased even by death, a stubborn declaration that his absence would not be voluntary? The letters had been uneven, jagged, but they had endured until men in overalls, paid to restore beauty, sanded them into oblivion. Lewis asked me once whether I believed Winslow had known he was dying when he pressed steel into oak. I could not answer him then. I cannot answer him now. Yet I return to the vision often. The young man bent low, eyes dimming, the hall echoing with silence, his hand struggling against time. Such moments defy certainty. They linger precisely because they resist resolution. The college, for its part, has chosen its peace. The fellows speak no more of Winslow. Mrs. Ellison, her confession unrecorded, will fade into her own silence. The story has been smoothed, sanded, returned to its acceptable form. Voluntary absence, a phrase that deceives only those who wish to be deceived. I stood there until the last of the light withdrew, the quad sinking into shadow. The damp stone smelled of rain and moss. My coat was heavy on my shoulders, though the air was cool rather than cold. I felt the ache that comes when one has seen too much and knows too little can be done with it. Some names are carved into oak, others into paper. All fade sooner or later, under sandpaper or fire. Yet memory is not so easily erased. The fellows may dine without guilt. The tables may gleam without scars. The diary may burn to ash. But Winslow remains, as real in my mind as the drizzle on stone, as persistent as the whisper of rain against glass. Some names fade, but not in Morse's mind.